So I was asked to speak to the topic of developing vernacular Eurasian resources then and now. And I chose to extend my comments to not only cover then and now, but to also talk about then and now and then. Because what I really want to focus on is important trends and developments as they're defining not so much where we've been and where we find ourselves, but most importantly, where I think we are going. My remarks also will focus at a pretty high level, looking at the research library, the context in which Eurasian collections have and will be developed and used by students and scholars. I'm hoping that in this afternoon's session, we'll translate some of these ideas into perhaps more practical thinking about where research libraries are going. But I really want to push this to a level of discussion and thinking that really challenges us not only to focus on the Eurasian collections, but the larger sphere of academic research libraries, where we find ourselves and where perhaps we think we are going. In that context, I've been working over the last several months on developing a, let's make sure we can get the technology working properly. Okay. Developing sort of a grand scheme, if you will, about the history, current state, and future development of the academic research library. I would argue that prior to 1950, there were actually several handfuls of libraries that by current definitions we would describe as research libraries. I think this was a period of exclusivity, a small number of libraries on the East Coast, major research universities in the center and on the west coast of the country that were actually developing collections of breadth and depth that we would define in the current context of as research libraries. And therefore, I think the number of collections of Eurasian material, Eurasian materials that would allow scholars to come in and do substantive work were actually quite few. We like to think of Columbia as being part of that, New York Public as being part of that, but I think it's only after 1950, a period of popularization, I would argue, when we see not only an explosion of the number of academic research libraries across North America, largely governed by the increasing investment by the federal government in universities as the research centers of the nation, the expanded increase in international and global affairs, and therefore the growing international foreign language collections in a lot of our libraries, and the massive growth in the student populations. Therefore, the need for more universities, the need for more faculty, and just an engine of growth that defined that period up until 1970. I enter the library field just after 1970, and it was a period of the next 2 decades that I would describe as a period of discord. I think it's a period in which we see the entrance of technology into a relatively conservative analog environment. It's the period of time where we see the online catalogs beginning to replace the card catalogs. We see interesting and challenging labor management, growth of unions in universities and libraries. We see the publishers becoming increasingly vilified as not supporting the academy, but supporting the stockholders of the for-profit publishers. And so for the next 22 years, there's quite a bit of angst in the community, even as I believe the collections grew. All the budgets were challenged. I think it was a period in which foreign language Eurasian collections continued to be very strongly supported and advanced. And it's in this period after 1990, I call it the period of decadence, when electronic publishing really takes root and libraries of all types all academic libraries of all types across North America are able to build strong research collections with significant retrospective holdings. So it's not just those exclusive institutions that were able to build those collections prior to 1950, but suddenly, thanks to the growing consortial purchasing of collections by libraries, thanks to the increasing packaging of information, the digitization of historical collections by publishers, both here in Europe and in the former Soviet Republic, we begin to see community colleges, liberal arts colleges, small universities being able to make available large quantities of historical collections, research collections that had previously been the province of the major research universities. And we also see deep, rigorous interlibrary loan document delivery capacity developing among the library community. And so it's a period in which I think we'll look back on as a period of tremendous growth and potential in the availability of information through technology and through cooperation. I think the economic context, economic realities that struck in 09, 010, I think are creating what I call a period of parabiosis. You can say, well, where do you get that word from? Well, parabiosis is a biological term. It basically describes organisms that share body parts and share systems. And I believe we're seeing a period in which we're moving beyond sort of the kumbaya of the 1970s to 2010, where libraries held hands and worked together closely, and we're seeing, I think, a much more radical coming together of research libraries in order to sustain the capacity to build and make available large collections of international materials. We can't do it independently, so we're developing strategies to do it collaboratively, and not in the traditional cooperation sense, but through new types of combinations and integration of our work and our resources. And I believe after 2020, my prediction is, we're going to be in a period of particularism, where every academic library, if you will have the capacity to make available large quantities of research materials, and what will define a research library is the breadth and depth of the infrastructure, the expertise, the ability to bring that content into the teaching and learning and research and scholarly environments. And I believe in that context there will be several handfuls of libraries that will have the depth and breadth of Eurasian expertise and capacity to really support the work of scholars like you around this table. So this is sort of the grand scheme that I put out for your thinking about the history, current state, and future development. I believe that in the current context, where we have not only the challenges of economy, and we have the challenges of technology, the investments that we need to make moving forward, is I see a pretty broad-based reduction in the commitment and capacity of research libraries to collect and to service and to preserve global publications and resources in all formats. I see a very narrowing group of libraries that in fact have the capacity to do this. I think it's also true that we're getting a lot of new thinking around how we're going to work together, how these collaborations will come together. But I think up until recently, these collaborations have generally been shallow, they've been episodic, and they have been selective. There's not a national strategy around how we build international collections in support of learning and research in North America. And I think that as a result of these two trends, global education and global research, as we know it, will be influenced by this reduced library capacity to actually make these collections available. We used to talk about the most important research collections in foreign languages being available institutionally and collectively in North American research libraries. I believe that increasingly is not the case. And therefore, we're seeing international collaboration and international working relationships between North American research libraries and libraries in Europe and around the world as a fundamental part of our ability to serve our communities. It's very interesting that over the last several months, we've had a major legal pushback from North American and West European publishers on our ability to share and exchange materials outside the United States with other countries. which raises the question whether at the very point that we are reliant on international interlibrary loan and document delivery, the publishers are raising legal challenges under international copyright law about our ability to in fact do that. So we're facing not only the economic challenges, we're facing sort of the infrastructure expertise challenges, but now we're also facing some legal challenges to be able to support your work and the work of other scholars. Let me suggest that if at any point there's something that I've said that you would like to follow up on, have a discussion about, although we'll have some opportunity this afternoon to talk about a lot of these issues, just jump in. Going to take through a number of ideas, but at any point you think it's worthwhile to kick something around, please jump in. We have some definitional problems as well as we talk about these issues. I was raised, if you will, as a Russian studies, area studies librarian. Now we talk about global resources, although we tend to use these words interchangeably. And the reason why definitions and vocabulary are important is because as we engage the research community and the faculty in discussions about some of these questions, we need to have some commonality of language in order to not only work with each other, understand each other, but also to advocate with university administrations and with public policy leadership in Washington. We've now got this debate over regional studies versus global studies. At Columbia, we have about 40% of our student body are people who come from other countries to study at Columbia. And we're finding that when they tackle a global problem where they really want to work in terms of their research, in terms of their theses, they want to focus on a particular problem in the context of that global issue from their home country, from their home region. So one could argue that, yes, we're building this more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary strategy around international development, but when it comes down to it, people actually want to work in a particular country or a particular region, and therefore the importance of having those collections, those vernacular foreign collections, are important to support the work of those scholars. We also, as I mentioned, going back to the 1950s, during that period of enormous growth in the research university, we had lots of discussions, even back then. Some of you may have heard something called the Farmington Plan. The Farmington Plan was an effort in the research library community to actually assign responsibility among the major research libraries to build collections in a complementary way. It failed. We continue to suggest to our faculty and to our administrations that research libraries actually work together to build collections. It's a lie. We don't. We need to, and therefore the concept of radical collaboration, I think, has come to the fore, that the ability to really integrate a lot of our collection development strategies, our staffing, and our resources is probably going to be the only way that we're going to be able to build this coordinated approach. We've tried for 60 years to do it, and we basically have failed in our ability to coordinate the development of those international collections. Sometimes in our thinking about global resources, we tend to put too much focus on the selection and acquisition side. Clearly, our ability to get the material and to select the material of the highest quality and most relevance to the work of students and scholars is at the very front end of this process. But we also understand that the investment that we as research libraries make extend through a whole range of activities in terms of, if you will, cataloging it, enabling people to find it, being able to share it and distribute it, working with our scholars and students so they can understand and interpret this material, making sure that it is applied into the teaching and learning and research and scholarship environments. And the one area that we probably have had the biggest failure is our ability to archive this material going forward. We generally have focused our attention on the unique and special materials in terms of the long-term preservation of collections. And as we're seeing more and more, if you will, born digital content, websites, email, other things which are, if you will, substituting or replacing the traditional paper-based ways in which organizations and people have worked, we have a sort of a total failure in terms of our ability to capture organize, and archive the born digital record. And I will argue later that we have not only a gap, a major gap, in terms of scholars' ability to work in this period because of the absence and loss of born digital content, but we're seeing the whole integrity of the scholarly communication, scholarly publishing infrastructure eroded. If I write a paper on a particular topic, I publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, and half of my sources are in fact electronic sources, and you come to my work and you want to test out my ideas and look at my evidence, but half of those electronic resources have gone, disappeared, been taken down, moved, changed, you have to question the integrity of my work. And I believe the whole infrastructure is at risk unless we address that fundamental problem. But even as libraries have those sort of, if you will, traditional roles, we're also taking on a variety of new roles and responsibilities. And I would argue these are important in terms of advancing Eurasian studies, advancing scholarship and learning, but they also are diverting resources from some of the traditional areas in which we have worked. So libraries have learned how to come together to negotiate with publishers as consumers for content, for better price, for better terms, getting those publishers, if you will, to use standardized processes for distributing, describing, and preserving their work. So we've had some impact, but we devote a lot of energy to those negotiations. We're trying to sort of readapt a concept of the 1960s called readers' advisors, when faculty and students approached libraries and said, we need your help, librarian, in understanding the newly published work and understanding what's really good and what's really not relevant to my work. And so we're trying to reposition the library as an intermediary in the scholarly process, as an aggregator of the most important and most valuable work. We're also taking on major work as publishers, both publishers in the traditional sense, but more importantly in our digital library collections as we convert large quantities of our historical analog materials and publish them on the web. We're learning that we are not just serving our own faculty and students at our own institutions, but when we publish on the web, the world becomes our user community. That means we're being diverted, if you will, in terms of answering questions and following up and supporting users all over the world. New roles in the classroom, new understandings of how individuals, scholars, students use collections and apply collections. So we're trying to develop much more of an R&D, research and development capacity. We're trying to leverage our assets of space and content and infrastructure and technology to bring new revenue streams into the library. And as I mentioned, we are facing a whole host of policy issues, copyright, telecommunications, privacy, intellectual freedom, government information, public funding for Library of Congress, NEH, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore we're active in Albany, we're active in Washington, we're active in Geneva. And so I point this out only to demonstrate that the library that you work with at your institution is being pulled in lots of interesting and important directions that may or may not enhance your ability to do your work in Eurasian scholarship. And so I've created this taxonomy, if you will, of how do we look at the research library today and going forward. Clearly, we have this legacy responsibility. We are responsible for decades, if not centuries, of material that we need to preserve and continue to make available to you and to students and scholars. We do have to sustain an infrastructure of technology, an infrastructure of expertise, an infrastructure of space. We have this long-term repository role. Society sees libraries today as continuing to have some fundamental responsibility for not only preserving the content, but as content moves forward through technology, preserving your ability to access and use that content going forward. So we have a functionality responsibility that's been added to our content responsibility. We are a portal, a gateway, if you will, to the information of the most relevance and quality that supports your work. We've got this enterprise, this R&D, this fundraising, this resource development responsibility, and we are one of the few agencies that actually is representing the public interest in a lot of these national and international debates on issues of information policy. One of the things that libraries have slowly learned to do over the last decade is to build a greater capacity for assessment. We're being asked by our universities, we're being asked by our state governments, we're being asked by the grant funding agencies in Washington, some hard questions as to whether we are relevant, whether we have impact. And many of us have moved to develop full-time offices of assessment with staff who are trained in those areas. And not just to be responsive to these sometimes asinine questions that are coming out about our work, but more importantly, to work with our faculty and our students to better understand their needs and to improve the support that we provide. And so in our work here at Columbia, as well as in other major research libraries, these are the types of things we've learned about the importance of the student experience. What we're learning, obviously, and you experience this every day in the classroom and on your campuses, no limits of time and space, no lines, lots of, if you will, sandboxy type of expectations in terms of working with content and working with technology. One of the biggest challenges we're facing at Columbia, and it's true, I think, across the university and college communities, is we've developed and supported these rich information environments, and then students graduate and they go off somewhere. Maybe they land in a graduate school where they've got great resources, but very often they end up in government or corporate or other types of settings where suddenly they're cut off from these information environments that they enjoyed and benefited from. We also know that people want to control their space. They want to control their information environments. And we think that this is very helpful as we build library collections and services, particularly through technology, to understand and support what our students need and want. But we've had similar experiences in working and talking with our faculty. This is sort of a list of the things that we've learned from our faculty at Columbia, and which has been affirmed by similar studies at other institutions. This is what faculty tell us is really important and meaningful to their success and their advancement in their careers at an institution. So we need to ask the question, how do we measure libraries going forward? Do we measure libraries by the number of people who come in the front door? Do we measure libraries by the number of hits on our website? Do we measure it by the number of items that have been circulated out of the print collection? Or do we begin to see ourselves as measured in terms of graduate success, faculty productivity? And how do we draw those lines? That is something we're beginning to understand, learn, and perhaps be able to act on. And as we build Eurasian collections, how are we talking with you and with your students? And how are we understanding whether what we're doing, not just locally, but in relationship to other academic research libraries, is enabling your students to be successful and you to be productive as scholars? And I think these are very hard questions, but it's the very questions that we need to be asking. This is challenged. This is a taxonomy that I developed about 2000, 2001. I think it's still a relevant way to talk about the relationship between librarians and faculty. I would say that when I was born as a librarian, I found myself in a very servant relationship with the faculty at the university at which I worked. And I think over the period of discord, in some ways we developed as strangers. Faculty and students sort of lived in parallel worlds, and we sort of lobbed things back and forth across the campus to each other, but there wasn't this deep collaborative partner. And I think we're beginning to see a period where we're moving away from what I would call the friendship stage and hopefully avoiding the customer stage, and really building sort of the partner-team relationship between librarian and faculty member. We think the ability to continue to advance international collections, Eurasian collections at the major colleges and research universities in this country means that librarians and faculty have to think of themselves as working side by side. And therefore, I think we've got to break some of that historical baggage which has defined those relationships. This always provokes faculty in interesting ways. So it's not just a matter of content. Charles Kuralt, the late newscaster, once observed that thanks to the interstate highway system in the United States, I can travel from New York to San Francisco and see absolutely nothing. Content is important, that's clear, that's sort of the infrastructure. But what we're hearing from our users is that as we build these collections, access is critical. We need to be able to do new things that we've never been able to do before in the classroom and in our research. Everyone is trying to manage productivity individually and organizationally. And I want to control the information environments. I don't want the librarians to control my information environment. I want to control my information environment. So give me the tools and capacities to do that effectively. And I think this user expectation scenario, which has developed during the period of what I called the period of decadence, where more and more information was being pushed out, I think needs a lot more attention and a lot more development. So let me lay out some assumptions as we begin to hone in a little bit more on the collection side of this. We have to get, I suspect that we never had the capacity, but it was part of the fiction that we presented to you and to the administrations, that we could develop comprehensive collections in all formats at the major research libraries in North America. Even Harvard, and dare I say New York Public, has stepped up over the last decade to look at new ways, new roles, and new relationships. I think that as we build our collections, we're going to continue to be jerked around, if you will, by the vagaries of the university process. Academic priorities and funding realities are going to mean that it's going to be an up and down thing. And our ability to sustain our support, maintain our support in a particular area, particularly when we take on, if you will, a national collection role, is going to be increasingly challenged. And so the dependencies of the past and the present, I think, will erode pretty dramatically going forward. Collaborative collection development, I think, is going to continue to be a marginalized area. I think we're trying to understand it. We have new data, which enables us to understand our collective and comparative strengths and weaknesses, but the ability to act on that complementarity is unclear. And I think we're seeing much more of a honing in on the distinctive and unique collections, particularly as more and more of the historical literature becomes more generally available through Google and other mass production strategies. When all of that historical literature is available to everyone in a relatively easy way, we're learning that it's the unique materials, the Bakhmetev archives, if you will, cast that out across the broader community, that's going to define what is a research library going forward. Also, I think because of the economy and because of just the scope of the challenge of preservation and archiving, we're going to continue to see, I think, a somewhat balkanized and almost by default condition. That's unfortunate. There used to be a lot of leadership and financial support coming out of Washington to enable us to preserve collections. And now, as it has become far more complicated and far more challenging from a technology and financial perspective, we're seeing the resources available to do it eroding even further. We also, as I mentioned earlier, are seeing national information policy issues, that is, our ability to move collections across borders, increasingly compromised. Whether it's the internet policies of countries that block access to information, that force the takedown of born digital content, Think of China, think of Egypt. Whether it's the copyright policies that limit the ability of libraries to send materials around the world. You would think that in the current information environment, the current technology environment, when we acquire something electronically at Columbia, and someone at liberal arts college Y wants a copy of that article, we could just send it to them electronically. Well, we can't. We can't legally. I'll tell you here that we find ways to do it, but we in fact are expected to actually print it off before we actually communicate it. Now that doesn't make any sense in this world, but those are the types of limits and challenges that we're facing. We're also learning that in the absence of the research library community to collectively work with faculty to build sort of like these new disciplinary, multidisciplinary information environments, we're finding pockets of faculty and researchers setting up their own discovery and dissemination and content management strategies. So we're seeing a tremendous, not a coordinated approach, but a balkanization within pockets of the disciplines and within pockets of the regional studies areas where everyone's coming up with their own solutions in terms of managing and accessing electronic information. A great example is the archive at Cornell, where for decades the physics and computer science communities have developed this depository, this repository, if you will, for all the research in their areas of interest. And the stuff sits there, not in journals, not in books, not in government websites, but in a particular interest of the high-energy physics, computer science community. And you cast that out by thousands of disciplinary repositories around the world, each set up and each behaving in their own way. You get sort of a chaotic approach to scholarship that used to be supported through the work of research libraries. We also know that our ability to build and maintain and service these collections is decreasingly possible through traditional MLS, Masters of Library Science degree librarians. We're finding that the depth of expertise, the disciplinary expertise, the world region expertise that we need to work with faculty and students in these areas is not always available with individuals who have the master's degree in library science. And therefore, we're seeing a very different community of librarians step forward to begin to take on some of these responsibilities. And I wrote an article several years ago that got me into a lot of trouble, and that's a good thing. The name of the article was "Raised by Wolves, the New Feral Professional in the Academic Library." And what I observed, I did not advocate, but what I observed was that we're seeing more and more individuals taking on professional library roles with a diverse set of academic credentials, largely PhDs, who are stepping in for a variety of career reasons to see the academic library as a place to build out a career and bringing their expertise, language, subject expertise, and matching it against the needs of the community. We also have this enormous explosion in the other types of professional assignments which are in the academic research library. Space planners, human resource specialists, web developers, instructional technologists, fundraisers. I mean, you can go on and on and on. So it's not just a group of MLS-trained librarians who are working with the faculty to develop the collections. There's probably 40% of professional staffs in most academic libraries around the country, in fact, do not have the master's degree in library science. And it's creating, I think, some really interesting hybrid cultural issues and environments that we're learning how to figure out. I ask your indulgence for the use of the word 2.0 there. But I think it's a way to sort of provoke us to recognize that the subject librarians that we were are not the subject librarians that we are or will be. And as I look at the role and nature of the librarians who work in academic research libraries, those who are in fact carrying out the development of Eurasian and other international collections, there are some really provocative thoughts that came to mind as I brainstormed this. There's an interesting issue of allegiance. Does the librarian align him or herself with the academic department, with the institute, if you will, or do they see themselves as part of the library? That's an interesting social problem that we're trying to work through. We also know that there's this sharing of responsibilities going on. You probably are aware that in the case of Rob Davis, he actually is the Russian, East European, Slavic, Eurasian, Central Asian, East European, et cetera, librarian for both Columbia and Cornell. And so he is supporting the faculty and students at two universities through his role here at Columbia under what we call the Too Cool Project. Columbia University Libraries and Cornell University Libraries, therefore Too Cool. We also are ready to accept the third institution, I should add. So Claremont or Catholic or Colgate can step forward if they want to. And we already have our acronym worked out. It's Trey Cool. We also have developed the concept of the embedded professional. When I was at Johns Hopkins, I worked there before I came to Columbia, we basically had closed the health sciences library, and we had moved all the librarians, all the information professionals out into the laboratories, the teaching departments, the bedside, if you will, of the medical campus. And we're seeing more and more of that now beginning to happen, not only in the sciences, but also in the social science and humanities fields as well. So how do the librarians become a more integral part of the working relationships within the teaching and research departments? We also know we've got this deep survival challenge that we're facing. The private institutions went through it over the last 2 or 3 years, largely because of the endowment issues. Now we're seeing the public universities. If you look at some of the Big Ten schools and the University of California, for example, what were, in fact, extraordinary research institutions with great research collections, they're having to make some hard choices in terms of what they'll support and what they're able to fund. And there's a lot of question marks in terms of going forward, what the next 3 to 5 years will look like. We're also finding that this whole concept of research information management, it's not just buying the collections so our faculty and students can use them, but more how do we enter and participate in the process of organizing the data and the evidence and working with the faculty to enable them to publish successfully in this information environment. We, for example, have created a center here called the Center for Digital Research and Scholarship, which is a team of individuals who actually work with our researchers and our faculty to negotiate more effectively with publishers, to create spaces in which they can publish books online, publish open access journals, and so forth. So it's a real interesting new role, a RIM, we call it RIM, Research Information Management function, that libraries are taking on. I mentioned the percentage of researchers and students at Columbia that in fact come from other countries and have expectations that we will be able to provide materials published in their home countries and in the languages that they've worked with. And I think our capacity to do that at Columbia, and if you cast that out across the colleges and universities in North America that host large numbers of international students and researchers, our ability to provide that support is increasingly compromised. We also are trying to see if we can play a more effective role in educating our own students as they go abroad. Lots of institutions have built pretty aggressive strategies to require or at least have high expectations for their undergraduate students to spend a certain period of time working outside the United States. I was at Notre Dame for a number of years, and I know that they have I think almost 80% of their students, undergraduate students, end up for some portion of their undergraduate life outside. We think that the ability of universities to sustain a rigorous and relatively comprehensive foreign language education program is fundamental, is integral to our building of foreign language collections. If we don't have students, undergraduate and graduate students, who can work with these languages, why are we building these collections? So we're beginning to raise, I think, concerns about whether we should have, I don't know what the number is, but we cataloged over 160 languages in the library collections at Columbia last year. Princeton and New York Public, I'm sure, are in the same ballpark. Why? Why are we doing this? Well, we continue to feel we have a national role and responsibility, but the capacity of our community may not be able to take advantage of those resources. We've got this phenomena of the global campus and the research center. Lots of debate and play in the higher education literature about the sanity or insanity of these global ventures. Columbia has taken the position that we're not going to build campuses abroad, but build research centers, places, sort of footprints, if you will, around the world where we can actually create opportunities for our faculty and students to interact with counterparts in those world areas. I think the jury's still out in terms of the success and viability of that overall strategy. That is, we haven't figured out how to pay for it. And therefore, I think lots of universities, as they move outside the United States, bump up against sort of economic, political, social realities that maybe they hadn't planned for. Think of the universities that have major centers in the Middle East and how they've been challenged in the current situation. And we've already talked about the user behaviors. OCLC, I assume you've heard of the WorldCat database. This was a major bibliographic resource starting in the late 1970s. I'm required to tell you that I am on the board of OCLC, but I do think it's a great tool. And one of the important elements of WorldCat and OCLC over the last decade has been the internationalization. And libraries, research libraries, and national libraries all over the world are contributing their bibliographic records to the WorldCat database. Now, less than 50% of the holdings in WorldCat, in fact, are English language materials. And so it's raised the prospect among faculty and students of their ability to get their hands on lots of international materials because of the general availability and use of the WorldCat database. It's the tool through which we manage interlibrary loan in a lot of our research libraries, and a lot of our academic libraries around the United States. And again, those policy issues that are being raised to block access across national borders is creating some interesting problems. We should get into a debate at some point over the over the survival of the print journal and the survival of the print book as we know it. I think there are some interesting economic and academic trends which are pushing us in a pretty rapidly in a direction where we have to question whether 10 years from now the analog format for scholarly communication will in fact be viable. The e-journal revolution took about 20 years. So starting at about 1990, we saw lots of the scientific, technical, and medical literature begin to move online. And I was involved with the founding and advancement of Project Muse at Johns Hopkins, which was the first real venture into the electronic publishing of humanities journals. And now, I think 20 years later, 2010, one could sort of declare the revolution is over. That doesn't mean that there's still not lots of print journals sitting around library collections, but it's been enormously depleted. And we're seeing much of the journal literature captured, the back files captured electronically. So we have raised questions about the continuing warehousing of print journals within our central libraries. And now we're beginning to see a real rigorous debate over the future of the extended argument in print, the scholarly monograph as we know it. I think it's going to be a revolution that's going to move much faster. And the reason it's going to move much faster is the people who are walking down Broadway today have no idea what an electronic journal is. That's our province, and it took us about 20 years to make that change. But they know what books are. And so the electronic book, because of the consumer and commercial aspect of this, potentially will move much more quickly. And we can debate the pros and cons of reading online and so forth, but I think there's a certain inevitability that people want to be able to search, at least, books online, if not necessarily read them online. This has been fueled to a large extent by these mass digitization projects, where we've seen millions, I think we're somewhere in the area of 14 to 16 million historical volumes that have been digitized. Those which are out of copyright are generally available online through most of our libraries. And we're working pretty aggressively in the library community to out the in-copyright stuff, recognizing that there are certain intricacies of American copyright law that in fact enable us to open up in-copyright content. And we're doing a lot of research collaboratively to try to make that happen. I've talked a little bit about the websites, and I do want to talk about the cyber infrastructure a little bit. We've got this sort of GIS revolution going on too, Geographic Information Systems, where it used to be that the public health folks and the business folks used to want to come into our libraries and to map data against geography. But we're now finding that all disciplines are increasingly interested in that type of geo-analysis. We're seeing a lot more historians, a lot more political scientists come in and work with that. And as more and more of the data is coming out of different world areas, as more of the census data, economic data, population data, public health data comes in from around the world, people want to do the deep type of analysis that the GIS technologies and systems enable. I've talked a little bit about the websites and the real difficulty of capturing and archiving and making that available. I've talked a little bit about repositories. It's of great interest to me the chaotic environment we've created in terms of where you and where scholars are putting their work. Scholars used to put it into what I call the publisher repository. And we could depend on, that was the place that we went to access and use information. Usually it was a printed object. Increasingly now it's a database, but it's still owned and served by the publisher. But people are putting it up on their own websites, their own work. They're putting it up on institutional repositories, Columbia Academic Commons. They're putting it up on disciplinary repositories of which there are thousands. They're putting it into government repositories. In some countries, there's a mandate to put stuff into national repositories. And so I think we're creating this sort of chaotic environment of the output of scholars, not sure which one I cite, which one will survive, which one's the right one, which one hasn't been changed. So it's a real interesting problem which I think scholarship faces, and I think each discipline, those who work in different world areas, have got to be concerned. We're at a very good point for me to do this slide and then to take a break, and let me come back and share with you some provocative thinking about where I think we're going. What I've tried to lay out is sort of the historical and perhaps better the current state of the ability of research libraries to build, organize, curate, and archive international materials, and the larger context of the users, the faculty and students in those communities. And so what I've tried to do now is to say, okay, I'm not just going to sort of define the problems. What I'd also like to do is encourage us to think about where there might be solutions. And I don't think the solutions are viable at the institutional level. I think we've got to build out a more collaborative, if you will, radical strategy for helping us to sustain our ability to support teaching and learning research and publishing in these international fields. So OCLC, having brought in all of this content from the world's libraries, I think gives us the ability to at least understand the collections that exist. What is out there? Who has it? In what number of copies? Where are the unique holdings? Where are the collections of depth and breadth which define our ability to do our work? We have an organization called SPARC. You may have heard of it from your librarians. It's the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition. It was at a meeting in 1996 when we were sort of all wringing our hands at the Association of Research Libraries meeting and saying, oh, woe is us. The publishers are messing it up again. And we sort of collectively threw open the window and said, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. And we created this thing called SPARC. And Spark has been our collective lobbying effort, our collective advocacy effort to push back against the publishers and saying that we need to develop national scholarly communication systems that don't just depend on for-profit publishers to get the information out and shared among students and scholars around the world. Can Spark play a role in helping us think about new systems for scholarly publishing and scholarly communication? The Association of Research Libraries, I think, has a very central role in helping us, the research library community, to think differently about where we are going. Because I think we've understood that the capacities of our individual efforts will not hold up. And we've got to find ways to transform not only how we behave at the local level, but how we, in fact, interact and work together. The Digital Library Federation is another expression of a collective policy effort based in Washington. I was at a meeting of that group last Thursday, which is trying to understand what all this mass digitization activity means. What does it mean when 15 million volumes of historical material has been digitized? How do we make sure that if we come to depend on that, and that becomes our central point of access to this information, that it in fact doesn't get taken over by for-profit sector and doesn't get lost, if you will. Because we're facing, as I'll say after the break, some major decisions in terms of how we're going to react to this environment. The Library of Congress, which maintains some offices around the world for acquiring materials on behalf of the research library community, I think can help us think differently about the support and coordination of our foreign acquisitions efforts. They're actually pulling back from some of that activity at the very point when I think they need to be stepping out and helping us deal with that better. The Center for Research Libraries, it's a Chicago-based organization built in the 1950s with about 200 library members. They've created something called the Global Resources Network, in which they're trying to build partnerships between American research libraries and different libraries. So there's a Latin American project, there's a German project, and so forth, that are African Newspapers Project and so forth, where they're trying to make sure that we work with the organizations and communities at the local level to capture that material so that we don't lose it and it can be made available to students and scholars in the US. And then the Council on Library and Information Resources, I'm arguing, again, which is a Washington-based collaborative, really should help us build an overall strategy for how we're going to maintain our global resources capacity. So individual libraries, in my view, have got to come together as part of these collaborative structures in order to make sure that you and your students continue to have access to the international materials that you need to do your work. And so we should take a break. And when we come back, let me push around a little bit some ideas in terms of where we might go.